coming to this event on human rights and corporate supply chains, how to prevent UK companies profiting from human rights abuses overseas. It's being hosted by SME for Labour, the Labour Campaign for Human Rights, and the Labour Campaign for International Development. My name is Matthew Turner, I'm chair of LCHR, and I'll chair the discussion today. We've got a fantastic panel, and just before I introduce them, I want to give a very short story from history. In 1862, 160 years ago, in the middle of the US Civil War, Abraham Lincoln's ships were blockading the export of cotton from the southern states to the UK. And this had a devastating effect on the Lancashire textiles industry and the mill workers, and they faced starvation and destitution. And yet, on the 31st of December of that year, 1862, cotton workers met together at the Free Trade Hall in Manchester, and they declared their unwavering support for the Union in its fight against slavery. It was an extraordinary act of solidarity. Those workers had no personal connection to the slaves in the American South, but they believed in human dignity, and they took a stand despite the personal cost to themselves. And I start with that example for two reasons. The first, because it shows that although British companies and British landowners and aristocrats historically have profited from slavery, British workers have a proud tradition of opposing it. And second, history repeats itself, because here we are 160 years later in the 21st century, and again, in a different part of the world, slaves are picking cotton and British companies are profiting from it. I'm of course referring to the Uyghur people in Xinjiang. So the question for today and the discussion we'll be focusing on is what can and should the UK government or a future Labour government do about that? First, we'll hear from Mark Dern, who's the director of the Corporate Justice Coalition, a coalition of organisations and individuals fighting against corporate abuses of human rights and the environment. Then we'll hear from Dan Leader, who's a barrister and a partner at Lee Day, and has been at the forefront of legal claims in this country to hold parent companies to account for human rights abuses overseas. Then we'll hear from Emily Thornberry MP, the Shadow Secretary of State for International Trade, about how trade and human rights can be reconciled. Then we'll hear from Rahima Mahmood, who's the director of the World Uyghur Congress in the UK and the founder of the Stop the Uyghur Genocide campaign, about what a new law holding UK companies to account would mean for the Uyghur people. And finally, we'll hear from Stephen Kinnock, who's arriving a little bit later but on his way, Shadow Minister for Asia and the Pacific, about what an ethical Labour foreign policy might look like. So without further from me, let me pass over to Mark to start.
Thanks, Matthew. And thank you very much to the Labour Campaign for Human Rights, SMEs for Labour, and the Labour Campaign for International Development for having us here. And also particular thanks to Emily, who our coalition has met before to talk about some of these issues. About us, Corporate Justice Coalition has been around under different guises for around 20 years. And we've worked on legislation and campaigned for legislation, including the Companies Act, the EU's Non-Financial Reporting Directive, and the 2015 Modern Slavery Act. At the moment, we are campaigning for a new mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence law. It's a very complex name, but I'll explain what that means shortly. And in July, we had 30 organisations coming together to call for this in a statement covered by The Guardian. Among our coalition are organisations including the World Wildlife Fund, Friends of the Earth, the TUC, Unison, and Anti-Slavery International, among many others. So if I can first reflect a little bit on the title of this session, which Matthew just mentioned. Yes, we fundamentally must prevent UK companies profiting from slave labour, but more than this, we must also prevent companies and public money from profiting from or being complicit in all human rights abuses and environmental and climate destruction. And to do that, we believe we need a new law modelled on the Bribery Act provisions, obliging companies and the public sector to undertake human rights and environmental due diligence, and to hold companies legally liable when they fail to prevent these harms from happening. A little bit about the current reality, and this is very well summarised by a question Lisa Nandy put to her then opposite number at the beginning of this year. And this is in relation to the horrific week of forced labour abuses that is still going on today. She said, what law precisely would a company be breaking if it imported cotton produced under conditions of forced labour? And the answer, not that her opposite number put it this succinctly, is no law would be broken. As our campaign statement from 2019 said, and I quote, "There are still no laws in the UK specifically requiring companies to take action to prevent and rectify human rights abuses and environmental damage, and to hold them liable when they fail to prevent those abuses from happening." So the background to our call. In 2011, the United Nations put together the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, often referred to as the UNGPs. These mandated 3 pillars: a state duty to protect human rights, a business responsibility to protect them, and an overarching duty to provide remedy or access to justice from people who suffer from these abuses. And it also explicitly called for mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence. And that's defined as an ongoing process to identify, prevent, mitigate, and account for abuses. And it called on states to explore civil, criminal, and administrative liability options. 10 years on, what we've seen is a domination of corporate social responsibility, an absence of hard laws, and as a result, abuses continue unchecked against the background on which companies profit from those abuses. However, more recently, we've seen slowly improving legislation over 3 generations. The first generation of these laws demanded supply chain transparency, and the Modern Slavery Act is a version of that. The second generation said, be transparent, but also identify risks in your supply chain and act on them. We have the 2019 Dutch Child Labour Law, which asks companies to do this. And the third generation of laws links these first two: make your supply chain transparent, identify and prevent abuses, with legal liability. In 2017, the French brought in the Duty of Vigilance law, which does this. And right now, among European states, Netherlands and Belgium are proposing laws with full-scale liability. Germany, Austria, and Norway either have laws or are about to bring in laws. And we have campaigns like ours underway calling for the same in the USA, Canada, and Ireland. Crucially, the EU is imminently set to table its own law, which will apply to all member states, and in terms of companies, to all companies operating in the single market. Now that means buying or selling goods or services or having a presence. And that means a huge number of British companies will fall under the provisions of this law. And that's why I believe that very soon you'll see UK companies also calling for a new UK law. So where's the UK government at the moment? We know from a response to a question asked in the House of Lords a couple of months ago that they say there is widespread voluntary adherence to the UNGPs. The UNGPs are only voluntary, and that our existing laws hold companies to account on human rights. Our existing laws do not hold companies to account on human rights. They ask them to report. And in reality, with the Modern Slavery Act, transparency in supply chains, 40% of companies do not comply at all. But they face no sanction whatsoever because there is no enforcement regime. And the Independent Anti-Slavery Commissioner herself said in reference to Leicester sweatshops producing for Boohoo, she was shocked at the irrelevance to the debate of the Modern Slavery Act. And in Boohoo's own legal report, commissioned to a QC, it was found that there was prima facie evidence of a breach of the UNGPs, but they have no force of law in the UK. So what we're calling for is a new law that, like the Bribery Act brought in by the last Labour government, holds companies liable for failing to prevent, in this case, not bribery, but human rights harm, and obliges them to do, in this case, human rights and environmental due diligence as a means to ensuring that harm doesn't occur. This is directly in line with a recommendation from the Joint Committee on Human Rights made 4 years ago in 2017. And the question has to be asked, if we already do this for bribery, why are we not doing it for human rights? At the last general election, Labour and the Liberal Democrats, to different extents, had proposals on the table for this, and a Conservative think tank undertook polling which found that across all ages, people preferred punishing companies that act irresponsibly. And this has been backed up by similar polling in the last couple of years, and what we've heard in Red Wall focus groups, showing that a majority of the British public believe we must do more to tackle bad behaviour by business. So against this backdrop, we warmly welcome Labour's new Putting Workers First trade policy, which goes far beyond anything the government is considering at the moment, although we do have some recommendations for tweaks, which I won't go into now. So to conclude, for a brief time after the Modern Slavery Act came into force, for all its failures, the UK was nonetheless a leader on this issue. It no longer is. We have moved from leader to laggard. But there is an inarguable moral case, political case, and legal case, which I believe Dan will expand on, alongside a strong business rationale for a new law. It was Labour that set the genuinely world-leading template for the new law we're calling for, which led to a wholesale shift in corporate culture and practice on bribery. And we ask you to be there again to secure this overdue and greatly needed shift in how the state regulates big business to protect our shared, hard-fought-for rights, both here and around the world.
Thanks, Mark. Dan.
Thanks very much. Huge pleasure to be with you today to discuss this really critically important issue. As Mark has said, I'm a lawyer at Lee Day. Lee Day is a very unusual law firm because we have a large international department that focuses entirely on corporate accountability cases against multinationals who commit serious human rights and environmental abuses overseas. And we bring cases to London only if it's impossible to get justice in the local jurisdictions, and sadly, in vast swathes of the developing world, it's an absolute non-starter for getting justice locally. So I work at the coalface of trying to get a remedy for victims of serious human rights abuses. And it's fair to say that whilst we have made very significant progress through the UK courts, most notably 2 very recent Supreme Court judgments, the legal landscape remains hugely problematic. And so I wholly support what Mark has just said. In my short time, I just want to make 3 brief points. Firstly, what is the current legal landscape? Well, I think over the past 10 years, we have seen a growing realization that self-regulation, voluntarism, and soft law mechanisms like the OECD guidelines are wholly inadequate and not fit for purpose. The numbers of examples I could give you, which illustrate the point, are multiple. Just to give you one, last year I represented 95 victims of serious human rights abuses who lived near a Kenyan plantation run by a UK multinational called Camellia PLC. This plantation had all the ethical accreditations you could ask for, including awards from ethical organisations. Actually, what had happened were there were incredibly serious human rights abuses going on in our plantation, including murders and rapes by their guards. This was only exposed because Lee Day brought a case with the Kenya Human Rights Commission. And overnight, when this was reported, all the UK supermarkets stopped buying the supplies from that plantation, that company. 70% of their market was lost overnight. None of that would have been exposed had voluntarism remained the only route. Hard reality, however, is that for most victims of corporate human rights abuses, there is simply no accountability and no prospect for remedy. I'm sure you'll be talking about that, illustrating that point very closely. And as Mark has said, whereas Britain led the way for abolishing slavery 200 years ago, now we're very firmly falling to the bottom of the class. Don't be fooled by the UK Modern Slavery Act. It's a start, but actually even with the reforms, there's no accountability, no oversight, no sanction for companies that actually have modern slavery in their supply chain, and certainly no remedy for victims of human rights abuses. Doesn't come close to the kinds of laws we're seeing breaking out all over the EU and now being mooted in Canada and elsewhere. But where government policy is failing, the UK Supreme Court thankfully has stepped in to some degree. They've now ruled unanimously twice that multinationals in this country can be sued for harms committed by their foreign subsidiaries in the developing world. Case of Vedanta and case of Shell. Not only can they be sued, but the scope of liability is much broader than anyone ever dared hope for. And the multinationals' attempt to limit the scope massively backfired. The Supreme Court, in essence, said if multinationals say they're going to do certain things with regard to human rights in their supply chain, and within their corporate groups. It will hold them to that. If they fail to act, that could give rise to legal liability. Fair to say that's given rise to complete shock in boardrooms across the country. Second point is, what are the problems, therefore, with the existing legal framework? Well, in short, despite the progress that we've made in the case law, the law is simply not fit for purpose. Holding companies to account remains hugely difficult, expensive, and time-consuming. Few cases can be brought, it takes years to litigate them, and at huge expense. So to give you an example, I'm representing a community in Nigeria that's suffering from chronic pollution by Shell oil, decades of pollution. It's taken 5 years even for it to get jurisdiction in this case, and Shell is still not supplying them with clean water. The result is, at the moment, the situation is getting remedy for victims is hugely expensive, hugely difficult, and vanishingly small amounts of people get it. But more importantly, well, not more importantly, but as importantly, the way the current law is framed by the Supreme Court, it means the more a multinational does to try and stamp out modern slavery and human rights abuses, the more likely they're going to be held legally liable. The incentives are totally skewed. You're incentivized to do less and not more. That cannot be right in the current, given the current situation. And because there's no proper legal framework, this means that UK consumers, UK investors cannot have confidence that there are not major problems lurking in their supply chains. As the Camellia example I gave you illustrates, it just takes one case for an entire market to disappear overnight. Surely that can't be a satisfactory state of affairs. So thirdly, is human rights due diligence failure to prevent a solution? Well, in my submission, it would be a major step in the right direction. It would ensure that there was real, as opposed to cosmetic, due diligence to spot human rights problems as and when they occurred and prevent them from becoming entrenched. It would give real confidence, therefore, to consumers and investors alike. It would level the playing field between good and bad business. It would solve the incentive problem that I've been talking about and ensure that actually you are not going to be penalised by trying to do the right thing as a business. And thirdly, it would radically improve access to remedy for victims of serious human rights abuses. Lawyers like me wouldn't have to spend their time trying to figure out how a case would be possibly brought against a multinational. It would be for the multinational to explain to the court how these human rights abuses arose under their watch. I think future generations are going to look back in shock that this state of affairs was allowed to persist as long as it has, much as we now look back in total disbelief at the way in which UK companies were involved in slavery 200 years ago. Labour is looking for big, bold, inspiring ideas. What could be more big, more bold than to seek to end the UK corporations profiteering from human rights abuses?
Great segue to Emily.
Thank you very much. And can I thank the Labour Campaign for Human Rights and the Labour Campaign for International Development and Small Businesses for Labour for organising this event, supporting it. This is such an important issue, and I'm so pleased that we have this platform organised. I have to say that the people that are appearing on this platform you have an outstanding platform appearing in front of you, and it is an absolute honour to be on that platform with them. The debate is especially timely, in my view, given that 10 days ago China applied to join the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the CPTPP. Now, not a lot of people know what the CPTPP is. In fact, very few people could even say it. But one of the people who does say it a lot is Liz Truss, because what she was always saying was that the Trans-Pacific Partnership was going to be where we would end up once we left the European Union. So this was the solution to Brexit, was to join the CPTPP. And the fact is, I kept saying to her, well, this is all very well. And in fact, one of the 238 questions I asked her was, what's going to happen if China applies? Are we going to be able to stop China applying? Will China be able to stop us applying? And we're going, oh no, really, you're just exaggerating. There's really no problem at all. They're never going to do it. Well, guess what? They're applying to join the CPTPP. And we have consistently warned them about this. And basically, I mean, seriously, it could mean that because of this plurilateral agreement, we could end up in a trade agreement with China. Now, the reason that matters is, in my view, that the debate over corporate supply chains, the reason it matters for that is very clear. You cannot, as a government, ask private companies to police their supply chains in a particular country for the use of forced labour and child labour if you're simultaneously entering an agreement with that country, accepting they meet the rules of that agreement, and therefore give them a clean bill of health on the issue of workers' rights. I mean, there's already concern, frankly, in relation to CPTPP, in relation to Malaysia and to Brunei, and to a certain lesser extent in relation to Chile and Mexico and Vietnam. But once you put China into that equation, then that completely goes off the chart. And this has two immediate consequences for policy in this area. First, we've got to go back to what the Labour Party proposed earlier this year, in line with Alton's cross-party amendment on the Uyghur genocide, and write it into law that the UK must not enter into any form of preferential trade agreement, bilateral, plurilateral, with a country that commits serious violations of human rights and workers' rights, and that Parliament must have a right to block any agreement which raises that risk. Now, we haven't talked about trade in this country for 50, 60 years, so it's difficult, to kind of get your head around some of these things. But may I say, I appreciate that 70% of this room know what I'm talking about, but 30% don't. If you enter a preferential trade agreement, if you sign up a trade agreement, what you're doing is you're saying, you're my friend. And because you're my friend, you're going to be able to have access to my markets in an easier way than other countries. And you can put strings attached to that. You can say, yes, you can have a trade agreement, but I expect certain things to happen. And if you had a modern trade policy looking towards the 21st century, then what we would be able to do with trade is that we could make trade a force for good. We could make trade a force for good and say, yes, have access to our markets, but there are a number of things, and whether it's climate change, whether it's workers' rights, whether it's human rights, there are a number of strings that you can attach to that, and you can say, this is the type of relationship we want to have with you. But we don't get that from this government, I can tell you. Second, we must demand this, that the government changes its approach to negotiations on accession to the CPTPP. It needs to come with some concrete proposals to strengthen the rights of workers and those provisions in that agreement, and we have to make sure that they're rigorous and enforceable. And yes, let's be honest about it, we need to significantly raise the bar when it comes to the need for China to comply with those. Those are the minimum changes that the government needs to make in this area of their responsibilities before we can make greater demands of business in relation to their responsibilities also. I mean, when it comes to the CPTPP negotiations, when I asked Liz Truss what it was that our offensive asks were, what is it that she expects, what does she want? It is nothing. They do not want to change CPTPP, they're not even prepared to negotiate on it. That is where we are. So, it's right and necessary that we do make demands, greater demands of business, and the LCHR have been consistently right to demand the introduction of new due diligence laws, which would make UK companies financially liable for allowing the use of forced labour and child labour in their supply chains. And I was proud at TUC Congress earlier this month to make a formal commitment on behalf of the Labour Party, on behalf of a future Labour government, to introduce precisely such a law. We cannot be in a position where UK companies are selling goods or importing raw materials that are the product of a systematic program of enslavement and genocide by the Chinese state against the Uyghur people, and simply say in response, well, we didn't know. And the same should be true for imports from Africa using child labour, imports from Southeast Asia using indentured migrant labour, or imports from South America produced on land stolen at gunpoint from indigenous people. That is what we should be doing. And I've also consistently made it clear in recent weeks, alongside my colleague Bill Esterton, who's standing in the door, that we must also ensure the same rules apply when we're talking about corporate supply chains. But we also need to make sure that it's equally applicable to public procurement as well. We cannot have, just listen to this, right? If you haven't heard this, hold on to the wall, because this is extraordinary, right? We have a Department of Health that that is awarding the next £11 billion worth of contracts to medical gloves companies in Malaysia and face masks from China. And they are acting with exactly the same disregard that they did last year over whether forced labour, including Uyghur labour, is being used to make that equipment. We could use that £11 billion to say, we will buy your gloves, we will buy your masks, but only on certain conditions, and use that clout to actually raise the bar, to raise standards, to protect workers internationally. We could be a force for good. Have I had an answer to the letter that I wrote to the Secretary of State for the Department of Health? Have I? and at this moment, he is giving out these contracts. And there is not that accountability that we could be using. What are they doing? We will need to continue that. Before awarding the next generation of contracts, from 2022 to 2024, the Department of Health must establish which overseas factories will be used to produce that equipment. It must require independent assessments of their compliance with international labour laws, and it must have in place its own control mechanisms to verify those assessments. That's what we say, that's what they should do. And in that way, we will entrench the demand for due diligence across both the private and the public sectors, and ensure no importer can simply shrug their shoulders and say, well, how do we know how these goods are made? That excuse was never good enough, and we will make sure that it is never used again as a defence in law. But let me make clear as well that I think that this policing of supply chains and the prevention of suspect imports is too important to an objective to be left to business alone. And clearly, it's too important to be left to the NHS, I'm afraid, as well. So that is why I am determined that alongside our reforms on due diligence and public procurement, and alongside our stronger use of Magnitsky sanctions, a future Labour government will introduce US targeted import bans to block the import of specific goods produced from factories, farms and regions overseas that we know are using forced labour and child labour. It was set up in the United States under President Obama, and they use withhold release orders, and they work on a simple basis. Suspected goods are impounded until the importer can prove that they have not been made in ways that violate human rights. And we've seen them use that in relation to cotton from Xinjiang, and that is it's really effective. And it's a way in which you can see how US import bans can work in tandem with boycott action that's been taken by US retailers. From 2018 to 2021, according to Nottingham University's Human Rights Laboratory, the US took 85 separate measures in response to the use of forced labour in Xinjiang. Compared to, how many do you think the UK used? No, we did use some. I mean, you've got to remember, we used Magnitsky, so we used those, okay? But, apart from that, so we used 11. And most of those, as I say, were Magnitsky related in terms of travel bans and frozen assets imposed on individuals. 61 of the US measures, more than 70% of their total, were targeted bans on imports. It's clear that by failing to follow suit, the UK government is not just avoiding its responsibilities, but it's missing a really large trick. And one of the reasons this matters so much goes back to what I was talking about at the outset, and the implications of the UK joining the CPTPP. Even if the CPTPP's labour rights provisions are strengthened, raising the bar for Chinese accession, we will still run the risk that Chinese goods produced using Uyghur labour will come into the UK via Vietnam, tariff-free and with minimal checks under the terms of the CPTPP agreement. And that's why our due diligence laws must also be backed up with tough policing and cutting-edge technology to identify the origin of imports and prevent the circumvention of our rules. I mean, I met this company, I was amazed. I was quite sceptical to start with, but they persuaded me that they can look at cotton and work out from the DNA where it comes from. How extraordinary is that? And the United States is doing that. And so they can work out whether, they can take a sample and they can work out whether this comes from an area where the Uyghurs are being used as slaves and ban it. Do we do that? What do you think? Instead of no one taking responsibility for what happens in overseas supply chains, we will make business and government equally responsible and put controls in place at every stage of the process, up to and including the trade deals approved by Parliament. Where this government treats the abuse of overseas workers as an irrelevance when it comes to trade, even ignoring the use of slave labour in our own NHS supply chains, a future Labour government will apply zero tolerance policies across the board and enshrine them in law. That's a massive change to an approach in our country. It's radical politics. I'm proud of it. But it doesn't make me hesitate for a second. In fact, it just makes me want to get on with it. And for us to ask why it is that it's taken so long. Thank you. Thank
Brilliant. Now let's hear from Brahima with a more personal perspective.
Thank you very much, and it is a privilege to speak at the Labour conference today and alongside my brilliant fellow panelists whose work on this issue I am so grateful for. Today I'm speaking as an activist, but I am also speaking from my lived experience as an Uyghur woman in exile. And this genocide has touched me personally, as it has been has every Uyghur living inside and outside of the region. I have been unable to contact my family for nearly 5 years. I still do not know if they are safe or interned in camps. Since 2017, the Chinese regime has turned my homeland, the so-called Xinjiang, or the Uyghur region, into a police state. Up to 3 million Uyghur people and the Kazakhs and the other Turkic minorities detained in concentration camps, where they face torture, systematic rape, and even organ harvesting. Uyghurs have suffered dystopian surveillance, mass sterilization, cultural erasure, and forced labor. China thought it could do this to us in secret, but there are brave people who took risks to make sure this story does not remain buried. Women like Dilnur Abdurrahim, who called her sister and asked her to tell the world that she was forced to work and sleep at a textile factory. She took that risk because she believed the international community would act. Instead, in many nations, the genocide has been met with indifference. Here in the UK, there have been strong words of condemnation, but weak actions. We have still not seen import controls or sufficient sanctions. We have forced the government's hand at every turn. And perhaps the most disturbing reality, some corporations in the West have actively benefited from the genocide as companies turned a profit from forced labor in their supply chains. Forced labor has long been a feature of the Chinese regime's system of control and discrimination. For decades, Uyghurs, including young children and students, have been separated from their families and placed into factories throughout China. It is important to recognize that forced labor is systematic and historic in China. It is not only in one place, industry, or age group. The mass incarceration of Uyghurs from 2017 gave the regime even more control over our communities and a growing pool of free laborers. And now in 2021, my people in the Uyghur region have been turned into slaves to the state. in almost every industry, whether it is solar, cars, technology, or clothing, thorough due diligence would find the poison of modern slavery. But the rest of the world must see that we are all deeply interconnected. The presence of forced labor in our supply chains links the UK government, corporations, and ultimately individuals to the torture, rape, and genocide of my people. Companies are not doing enough to ensure they are not profiting from forced labor, and the UK government has refused to implement laws that would force business to do so. Legislation to hold companies to account over human rights abuses would be a huge step for the Uyghur cause, and particularly if adopted by other nations, could deal a big economic blow to China. This is about upholding moral standards, having a red line. It is not just about Uyghur people. It is about communities that are currently or in the future do experience slavery and genocide. Any group that is forced to watch as their bodies are used to generate profit while their human rights are stripped away. I want to make it clear to you that this conversation is not about geopolitical agendas. This is about the trauma that Uyghurs are faced to endure every day. To watch our homeland taken from us, our communities destroyed, our culture decimated, and our spirit broken. To long for our families and friends that we have been cut off from, to fear for their safety. This fear is its own kind of torture, and it is designed to stop us from speaking out. I believe this conference is one of progressives, of people that fight for women, for minorities, for the underprivileged and ignored. That is why the Uyghur cause is naturally your cause, and why it is the duty of your movement to join our struggle. I know challenging China is not easy, but I want Labour to live up to its history as a party that confronts genocide. Your first MP, Keir Hardie, spoke up against Belgium's genocide in Congo. You were part of the government that fought and defeated the Nazis. You stepped in to stop ethnic cleansing of Muslims in Kosovo. Those people knew Labour was a voice for them in their darkest time. Today, my people look again to Labour. We need your voice. Thank you.
It's always so powerful and emotional to hear you speak, Cream. Thank you for that. We'll hear now from Stephen from a foreign policy perspective, and then we'll quickly go to the Q&A and have questions first for Emily because she needs to leave at 2:30. So if you do have questions for Emily, start thinking about them now. But I'll pass over to Stephen.
Well, thank you very much, and it's extremely difficult to follow what you just said, Rahima. You and I have worked very closely on these issues for some time, and it never fails to move me profoundly to hear what you said and what you say. And I think it reminds me of that famous quote from Harold Wilson, which is, "The Labour Party is a moral crusade, or it is nothing." And when it comes to dealing with China, that is the line, the fact, the reminder that we must keep at the heart of our policy. I'm not going to say a huge amount about the specifics of human rights due diligence and transparency in supply chains, because we've heard so many compelling arguments about why this is the right thing to do. It's so clear that the Modern Slavery Act as it stands is not fit for purpose and that it needs to be given teeth. And Emily has also set out so clearly the steps that we need to take as a Labour government in terms of putting ethics and values and the defence of human rights at the heart of our trade policy, just as we do at the heart of our foreign policy. But what I thought I might say, I mean, the elephant in the room here is China. So I thought it might be useful just to, so it complements a little bit what we've heard, to say a little bit about our thinking on China. And it's absolutely clear that the Cold War analogy doesn't work when it comes to China, because the Soviet Union was essentially ring-fenced from the rest of the global economy, whereas we are, whether we like it or not, profoundly interdependent with China. They are in it pretty much every supply chain that affects the British economy. So we cannot use Cold War thinking in the way in which we address China. And in my view, and this is very much emerging foreign policy for us, but we need a strategy which is based on three pillars: confronting China, cooperating with China, and competing against China. And I'll say a brief word about each of those. And the point is that you have to do all three of those things. And I'll say a little bit more about why they're not actually mutually exclusive. I think that they can strengthen and complement each other. They're mutually reinforcing pillars. In terms of confrontation, it has to be on our values and on our defense of international law and the rules-based order. What China is doing in Hong Kong is a blatant violation of the Sino-British Declaration. If we don't stand up against that, then we descend into the law of the jungle. So it's about defending the rule of law, defending liberty and democracy in Hong Kong. We have heard, no need for me to add to what Rahima has said about the horrific practices that are taking place in Xinjiang. And we have to see far more action from the government. Finally, we got them to include some Magnitsky sanctions, but they didn't sanction Chen Huangguo, who is the orchestrator of the atrocities against the Uyghur people. The genocide amendment to the trade bill, I mean, that was such an example of the shadow foreign affairs team and the shadow trade team working together, exposing the profound divisions in the Conservative Party. I mean, we almost got that over the line. We almost defeated the government on that. I think we were 2 votes short. We had 38 Tories rebelling against the government. And what that demonstrates is that there's some of this is being driven by fear. People look at what's happened to Australia, where China has slapped huge tariffs on Australian beef and barley and many of their key exports. And people are worried, they're scared about what China might do in terms of retaliation, in terms of trade. With the retaliation against us putting legislation like this in place, by the way, we need to go into this with our eyes open. The Chinese Communist Party is an utterly ruthless Marxist-Leninist organization that only deals in power plays and will attempt to crush any opposition that it faces. So there is some fear in all of this, but we have to stand firm, we have to stand tall, and we have to build alliances. That's the other fundamental problem we have with this government. They spend their entire time burning bridges with our democratic allies. So we need a Labour government that's actually going to rebuild bridges with Europe, create that alliance, and that, I think, a big opportunity there is in what I call the competition pillar, which is in much more cooperation amongst democratic countries in artificial intelligence, quantum computing, military cooperation where necessary. We've got to stand tall against what's happening in the South China Sea. The Chinese Air Force buzzed Taiwanese airspace over 300 times last year. They're sending their battleships through the South China Sea, and there's thousands of cyber attacks. So we've got to work together, pool our resources, particularly in terms of technology, because we don't have the scale alone to compete with China. We've got to do it with other countries. And then, of course, there's a cooperation pillar, which clearly the key point there is around climate change. But China has a huge amount of self-interest in this. Their pollution levels are where you can hardly see your hand in front of your face in Beijing. They have got serious issues with desertification in large parts of the country. So They have to do something about climate change, and they know they need to cooperate with others to do that. Now, some people say you can't do the confrontation and the competition bit without undermining the need to cooperate. I actually think that completely the opposite is the case. Authoritarian regimes respect strength and unity and consistency, and they are utterly contemptuous of weakness and division and inconsistency. So by standing firm, by standing tall, by putting through the kind of legislation we're talking about today, by taking a clear stance on human rights and values, we will actually strengthen our ability to deal with the Chinese government on the basis of a platform of respect, rather than the current contempt that they hold us in when they see the divisions that explode within the Conservative Party over the Genocide Amendment, or indeed between ourselves and the French over the recent AUKUS deal. So we've got to be strong, united and consistent, building bridges with allies, working together, and on that basis there is no reason why we can't also cooperate with China where we need to. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Stephen. Okay, so we've got Emily and Stephen both need to leave in like 4 minutes. So I will take one question for Emily and one question for Stephen. Try to keep it focused on Labour trade policy or Labour foreign policy if you can. So I've got one at the back and one at the front.
I'd like to ask Emily a quick question. You mentioned that we're going to have zero tolerance for human rights. Like you fish. I wondered, at the moment I can go into the local Waitrose and buy food from Ghana, from Gambia, from Pakistan. We're going to have a World Cup in Qatar. Yeah. All places that simply by being gay you could be either have the death penalty, imprisoned, life in prison, etc. Will that zero tolerance cover countries that have policies against gay people?
Yeah, I mean, I think the human rights is human rights. I mean, I think that we need to be straightforward about this. I think we need to be a bit louder about this than we are. And I agree with you that it's like quite often when we talk about human rights, we talk about human rights. Oh yeah, and there's gay rights too. So no, I do think that they need to be the same, and I think that we need to talk about all of these things, because humans are humans and rights are rights. Given that that's my question, can I also then just use this as an opportunity to plug a meeting I have tomorrow at 4:45 at the Preston Room with the New Statesman. I'm doing another meeting about human rights and trade, and we've got a really good announcement, which I'm really proud of that we're making. So do come on.
Was your question for Emily?
Yes.
Okay, let's take it quickly, and then I need one for Stephen.
Only if you've got a question.
Quick question. So it's on trade with Sri Lanka. 10% of Sri Lankan trade is with the UK, and it's continuously failing to meet its human rights obligations, especially under the GSP Plus agreement. With that in mind, and with the brutality that garment factory workers are being forced to, they're being forced into work, not being properly brutalised by the military and police. The military is increasingly taking over land in the north and east and businesses as well. What will trade look like? How will you make sure that it's actually abiding by these commitments to human rights? And how will Labour actually push the government to actually achieve this? Because we've seen those, leaks from Rob saying we'll cooperate with any human rights.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's amazing, what they say and how they just get away with this stuff, and how they're just not held to account. We do try. I mean, really, we try. So we don't have. I mean, the thing about trade agreements is we don't have a trade agreement with Sri Lanka. So so that's the point. We don't have a preferential trade agreement with Sri Lanka. If we did, then we would be able to have the kind of the conditions that we could put, and then use that trade agreement to be able to be able to have a bit of clout with them. So I mean that's what I'm essentially saying. And then I think that the other thing that I'm saying is that where it is clear. So people say, for example, that there's real problems with almonds from Turkey. and how those are harvested, and and it's well known that there are abuses there. So what I'm suggesting is that what we could do is, where there are suggestions where this particular product may come from a culture within a country which is deeply abusive, then we could impound that at the border and say, we're not letting this out unless you can prove otherwise. And so it's kind of, there's a series of different ways of approaching these things. But as I say, it is a question of using trade as a force for good. And it is really, a way of kind of having it as a sort of, as a strong arm of foreign policy, and the two things need to work together.
It's
better than sending in the military, let's face it.
It's half past, so I won't necessarily take a question, but if you have anything to add to either of those.
On Sri Lanka,
Right.
we're really worried about the trend towards brutal human rights abuses in Sri Lanka, particularly under General Rajapaksa. We feel that the draft resolution is not strong enough. There should be far more capacity given to the UN Human Rights Commissioner to go in on the ground to assess what has really happened, particularly in terms of the suspected genocide of the Tamils in Sri Lanka. And on the specific point of trade, when the EU didn't have a trade deal with Sri Lanka, but had a generalised system of preferences related. And so when we were an EU member state, we were of course part of that. Well, now everybody is saying about global Britain being the opportunity after Brexit, which we assume means that Britain will take a different position, whatever thinks is the right thing to do. Why is the government not clearly stating that it will not engage in generalised system of preferences with Sri Lanka, and that it will not do a trade deal with Sri Lanka, because it is absolutely clear that there are serious human rights abuses, there's a serious lack of accountability, and it's only getting worse under General Rajapaksa. So we're pushing the UK government, both from a policy and diplomacy point of view, but also on the trade piece, to make it clear that it won't do that deal. But as Emily absolutely rightly said, that's what we were told by the government on the genocide amendment to the trade bill. Oh, don't worry, we're never going to do a trade deal with China. But in fact, through the CPTPP, you end up doing a multilateral trade deal with China. So we of course don't trust the government at all on this, and we will continue to push to ensure that no preferential treatment is given to the Sri Lankan government.
Thank you so much.
If you guys need to shoot,
thank you.
it's absolutely fine. Thank you so much. We've been given just an extra 5 minutes or so. So if people do want to stay and ask questions to the panelists who are left, let's do it. Is that Richard Howard at the back?
It is, but that's just very quickly, Richard Howard, I steered the European Non-Financial Reporting in Parliament with the help of lots of people on the front panel, and thank you. And we should just say this is the week of the passing of John Ruggie, who was the visionary leader behind the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, and we should mark that. So let me say that. Two questions. One to Mark. Several of the human rights due diligence initiatives from Europe, and I'm currently working on the European-wide ones with a coalition called the Alliance for Corporate Transparency, but several of them have come from centre or centre-right rather than centre-left governments. I don't know how much there's any chance of getting anything through the Tories in the next few years, but you're doing some of the parliamentary lobbying. What are the tactics, what are the hopes in order to do this? And to Dan, I don't know if it's community still with you, but he is a great friend. But good for everything you're doing. In the European proposal, what we're wrestling with is how to stop companies just minimising their risk. And it's still out there. Human rights abuses are still happening, but they're going to say it's not our full gov, right? As opposed to them saying we're going to use due diligence to try and actually improve things and have impact, even if it brings us into risky territory, which obviously from a human rights perspective is what we want to see. How can we build into the laws, whether in Britain, Europe or anywhere else, that sort of culture of expansiveness rather than just minimising legal risk as a company?
Thanks, Richard. So the government When this government came into office, beginning of 2020, their position on this issue and more broadly was we will put down no new corporate facing obligation. A year and a half on, things are changing very, very slowly, but we can say that we were asked by the Cabinet Office to give examples, tangible examples of how a law like this could work. We know the FCDO is keeping a watching brief on the issue, but the biggest move the government has made is around the Environment Bill, which contains a due diligence schedule. I believe it's now Schedule 17, it was 16, and that's to do with products linked to deforestation. However, it's incredibly weak. What it essentially asks a British company to do is to ensure through its due diligence that it's obeying the local laws that exist in other countries. So nothing that groundbreaking. To answer your question about the strategy more directly, I mean, it's always difficult when you're campaigning against a government, for a government to bring in a policy that it doesn't like. However, we mentioned the EU's bringing in this proposal. A lot of companies in the UK are going to fall under this because they operate in the single market. You will then have a business case. As Dan mentioned, the effect of the common law developments has been quite perverse in that it's given companies a pathway to this is how we avoid liability. That presents, again, a level playing field issue. Surveys were given to British business around a year ago, which found that 70% believe they lack clarity and certainty on what to do around human rights. And that's a fundamental of the rule of law. How can you obey the law if you don't know what it is and you don't know what to do? 80% said a new law would bring that clarity. This to say, there is a building traction. Opposition parties, as you've just heard, are broadly in support of this. The public favours doing more to tackle bad business, and business is increasingly coming out to speak about this need as well. For us, those are the building blocks of what you need to compel a government, like the government we have at the moment, to change direction. I think we've all seen on issues like food poverty, they said no initially. Once it became scandalised with the help of people like Marcus Rashford, they changed position. That's what we're hoping to do. We're not sure we'll be able to get there, but we will be trying. But what is very clear is that it's people like you in this room, if you are part of that movement saying we need this change, the more the likelihood we're able to get it.
We'll quickly hear from Dan, and then we won't take any more questions, but we'll go outside, and if you want to speak to the panelists directly, that's fine, okay? Because I'm conscious there's a third event waiting. So Dan, quickly.
Right, just quickly. Thanks for the question. Let's not forget that in addition to all the really important discussion and policy thinking around supply chains, we've got, if anything, an even more basic problem, which is it's our own British companies that are directly committing human rights abuses with impunity in the developing world. Not just by buying things, but by themselves owning plantations which are committing human rights abuses, labour abuses, appalling environmental disasters, as in the Shell example. And so we've got an even more basic problem that we've got to tackle here, it seems to me, not just the supply chain stuff. And so let's not forget that. With regard to your question about how we move from, in your words, a culture of expansiveness from one of minimising risk, I mean, I think you can look to, for example, the French law, which has been in place since 2017, the Devoir de Vigilance, it's called, human rights due diligence. And there, the model is that the burden is on the parent company, or the headquartered company, to demonstrate that they have taken reasonable steps to prevent a human rights abuse when it occurs. And if they fail to convince a court that they have taken reasonable steps, then they are liable. Now that is a sea change from the current model, where we, as activist human rights lawyers, need to demonstrate that the parent company, by looking at its corporate structure, is sufficiently involved with its subsidiary before we even get to first base, before the courts will even look at the case. Otherwise, they'll say, well, why aren't we dealing with this in Sri Lanka or Nigeria or wherever? It's got nothing to do with the UK. So I think the human rights due diligence model, a properly framed law, would have the effect of an expansive culture of human rights due diligence, as opposed to what the current model, where the perverse incentives actually do encourage minimising risk and pulling back from human rights commitments. That can't be the way forward. We need to have a human rights due diligence model.
Thanks, Dan. I've got two quick announcements to make. The next event that's about to come in is called Beyond Excluded, What Can Labour Do to Support the Self-Employed After the Pandemic? So feel free to stay if you wish. And the SME for Labour Gala Dinner is on Monday the 8th of November. And if people want to join the reception and dinner, it's at Park Plaza, Westminster Hotel. Look, thank you all very much for coming, and we'll go outside.